What's happening, guys? Michael Corsentino for BehindTheShutter.com and Shutter Magazine with my February 2020 lighting tutorial. As you guys may or may not know, these videos are chock full of enough information to make them stand alone. However, they are companion pieces to my monthly column in Shutter Magazine. So if you have not already, do yourself a favor, head on over to BehindTheShutter.com and subscribe to the print edition of Shutter Magazine so that you can get tons and tons of fabulous photography education, business and otherwise, and technical, of course, delivered right to your door every month. And if you enjoy these videos, please be sure to check out all the other videos released every month on this channel. Please like this video and hit that subscribe button. All right, so this month what we're going to do is I'm going to give you a primer on the 8 things that I consider the most important when you're looking to purchase a strobe. And I'm calling these out as strobes because I definitely am an advocate for strobes versus hot shoe flashes. And the reason why is because basically at this point they're kind of at a parity price-wise. So for, in terms of the flagship models like Canon and Nikon, for example, their hot shoe flashes are somewhere around $650. Give or take, and you can get a really good studio strobe, and in some cases even a portable battery-operated strobe for about the same money. And while that's not inexpensive, it definitely, a strobe will give you typically, well, I would say not typically, but without a doubt, it will give you a lot more flexibility, a lot more power, almost 10 times the power than a hot shoe flash. And typically a lot more bells and whistles, a lot more flexibility creatively. So that's why we're going to focus on strobes. All right, so let's dig right into the 8 things to consider when purchasing a strobe. Okay, first up is exposure modes. You need to ask yourself a couple questions about the way that you're comfortable, the way you're most comfortable working. Are you comfortable in manual? Do you need a more automatic strobe? Do you need a combination of both? Do you need through the lens metering TTL? And will you require high-speed sync? Okay, so manual, typically for me, manual is something that I use more in the studio. It's dead simple, it works every time. It's simply a matter of more or less power and setting that on the pack or the strobe to get the amount of light output that you want. So you dial it up or dial it down, very simple. Automatic obviously does the thinking for you. However, it's going to make the decisions for you and kind of undermine your creativity a little bit. Now, you can override that with, by putting your own settings in after the fact. So that can also be something that you're interested in. Okay, TTL is same thing as kind of a semi-automatic feature where it allows you to dial in. You can adjust your aperture and you can adjust your shutter speed once the exposure has been determined by the TTL metering system. Right, and high-speed sync is something that you're typically going to use on location. So if you're doing more location work, use high-speed sync to knock down the ambient light and allow you to modulate the flash, for fill flash, essentially. So TTL and high-speed sync are going to be something that are going to be very much something that you're going to rely on location. TTL is going to allow you, what TTL does is it makes the calculations for distance, okay, between your flash and your subject. So if you're working really quickly, if you're on the move, if the distance between your subject and your strobe is going to be changing rapidly, that's where TTL is really going to come in to be an advocate for you, to come in handy, is what I'm trying to say. And high-speed sync is going to allow you to knock down the ambient light, hold those dramatic skies, and create a really dramatic look. It also will allow you to shoot more wide open because high-speed sync allows you to use shutter speeds that are faster than your camera's resident maximum sync speed. Okay, and that's really important because when you're shooting with strobe and you're shooting with ambient light together, oftentimes you need to balance them, all right? And absent high-speed sync, you're not going to be able to really do that. You're going to have to rely on your aperture, stop it all the way down, and that's going to give you a lot of background information, which you probably will not want if you're shooting on location. So high-speed sync will allow you to use faster shutter speeds, which will then allow you to open your lens wider, which will allow you to reduce the information coming in from the background, and then allow you to fill in a little bit with fill flash, just to use your artificial light to just fill in a little bit of light, and so you get the best of both worlds. You're able to have a really dark, moody background, hold the skies, get those beautiful clouds that you want in the sky, and use fill flash, because at that point your subject matter, you're in the foreground, will be underexposed, and then you just fill in with fill flash. So that's where high-speed sync really comes into play, and TTL as well. All right, so it really depends on how you work and what you need. In some cases, you may need a strobe that does all things, but with everything there are compromises. There's no perfect strobe for everything, but there are strobes that are good at a lot of things, but there's a certain point of diminishing returns where it leaves off. Like, it will do a lot of things really well, but perhaps it's not going to give you the most flexibility in the studio, and vice versa. All right, so let's take a look at a couple examples here. We'll start off with manual. Typically in the studio, I use only manual because, again, I don't need all those other bells and whistles. And because of that, in many cases, you're able to get less expensive strobes that have a lot more power, okay? And we'll talk a little bit about that when we talk about digital versus analog coming up. But here's a perfect example. Perfectly fine image created using only manual exposure mode. Same thing with this. And again, I'm using 2400 watt second packs for this. Now that's not something, that is something that is really cost prohibitive when you start getting into the more automatic, digital packs. So these are all manually operated analog packs, and we'll touch on that more. But for shooting something like this, here again, I use high-speed sync, like we talked about before, in order to knock down that background, hold those clouds, and create a balance between fill flash used on the subject in the foreground, and all of the ambient light, which is the dominant light in this image, to modulate those two, to balance those two. Okay, so different needs, but again, in the studio, those packs, those manual packs are 2400 watt seconds. Here on location, I'm using a 500 watt second battery pack, and the studio strobes are AC based, not DC based. And this is a portable lithium ion battery pack that we're looking at that was used for this particular image. Okay, so different needs, different strobes. Again, but there are strobes that will do both. But if you're good with 500 watt seconds, you can get away with a lot. There are strobes that will do both. All right, let's move on to size and weight. Another really important factor, and another thing that really depends on how you're going to use the strobe, how you're going to use the light. Will you be using it in the studio? Will you be using it on location, or a mix of both? If you're going to be doing location work and you're going to be putting lights on rather on stands or on boom arms, or asking assistants to hold those lights, weight is really a consideration. And it's also a consideration for lugging lights around. The heavier the light, the more onerous it is to start moving those lights around on location. Transporting them is a big factor. But even bigger is asking assistants to hold lights. So here is what I like to call a tracking shot. Here I've got a model in New York, and my assistant was holding a light on a stick, a paint pole to be exact, with a little adapter that allows you to mount a strobe onto it. And this light was advertised as portable, and in the day it was more portable than others, more portable than had been, but still it was about 5 pounds, and in short order my assistant was ready to murder me because this light was really practically too heavy to hold overhead for any length of time. And the same is true of this shot. That was from the same shoot, actually same day. So you really need to be cognizant of the weight of your strobes, especially if you're going to be using them portably. And if you're not, if you're going to be using them in the studio, then you need to have stands that are robust enough to hold whatever weight you have. So those are all factors you want to consider. For portable strobes, now I am somewhere in between the 1 and 3 pound mark. typically more toward the 1 pound mark, because I use Elinchrom LM Quadras, so the newer version of the Quadra, the ELB, because it's only the head. You don't have the pack and head built in together. It's not a mono situation. And I like those for a number of reasons, one of which is that if the light tilts over and hits the ground, only your strobe is broken, not the whole pack. With a mono head, if it hits the dirt, many times that whole unit is done. With a pack and head arrangement, I can just swap out a new head and I'm back up and running. So that's one of the reasons I like that. But they're also super lightweight. When you don't have all of that stuff packed into the head, the electronics as well as the strobe, you have a much lighter weight unit. All right, so that's why I prefer that kind of arrangement. Pack and head is the way to go for me. And here we are with, again, those studio strobes are much heavier. They're pack and head systems, and they would not work well on location. Okay, same with this. These are 2400 watt second packs, as I said, and then a separate head. They're old, they're clunky, but they do a beautiful job, and that's why I use them in the studio. All right, so let's move on next to minimum and maximum. Let's turn all of this on. Here we go. Minimum and maximum output. Okay, so what I mean by that is typically you'll have a rating for your flashes is, let's say, 500 watt seconds is your maximum output. But the minimum output is also really important. Okay, you need to consider both. Maximum output is going to go to things, again, how you're going to use the strobe. Are you going to be using it in the studio, on location, or a mix of both? Low power is just as important as maximum power. Typically, with location work, you're going to be using lower power because you'll be doing things like fill flash. Now, in some instances, though, you'll want to overpower the sun. So sometimes, depending on how strong the sun is, 500 watt seconds is not going to be enough. You may need more power, but more often than not, 500 watt seconds is going to give you enough. But every once in a while, you might get into a situation where you need more power. But lower power, as I said, is just as important when in the studio, because if you want to shoot with wider apertures and you're now in a studio situation, you want to be able to really dial that strobe down. So look at the lowest setting that you can get in your strobes, all right, when you're searching and researching specs for strobes. I have strobes that now will go down to, I think, 32 watt seconds or 50 watt seconds or something like that. That gives you a lot of flexibility, all the way up, and on the opposite side of the spectrum, all the way up to 500 watt seconds. Okay, so for example, this is again 2400 watt seconds, and this is 4 packs. And they weren't all dialed up to 2400 watt seconds, but I was working with an 8-foot scrim, creating even light all the way across. So I had 4 units going, a lot of light, creating a beautiful bath, a swath of light just wrapping around this model. Whereas this is a 500 watt second strobe, just getting a little bit of fill flash. Okay, so very different needs for those strobes. But here, conversely, in the studio, is one of those scenarios where I wanted to shoot with a wider apertures. I'm in the studio. I don't need a lot of light. This is using a 500 watt second studio battery operated strobe. Sorry. Where I had to put a lot of diffusion in front of the lens and neutral density filters, rather, in front of the light. And I needed to do that to knock down the light because there was just too much light. So even dial down at its minimum wattage. I forget what that is. This is 1200 watt second Pro Photo pack. But because at the time I didn't have those lights that you could dial down to 50 watt seconds. But that's why it can really be useful to have something that you can dial way down. It gives you a lot of flexibility, because oftentimes you don't need a lot of light, especially in the studio when you're doing something like this, kind of low-key lighting. All right, power source is the next thing. So again, let's talk about it. AC versus DC. So with battery-operated strobes, you're going to have some limitations on the amount of output that you can get. As I said, like my studio strobes, which are AC mains-operated strobes, I can get packs that are 2400 watt seconds. And as you'll see in the next slide, you can get them fairly inexpensively if you need that much power. And oftentimes you do. If you don't need that, oftentimes you can there are strobes that will do both, that will allow you to plug them in, that are battery operated. You can plug them in the studio, and you can use them battery powered on location. And those are typically max out at about 500 watt seconds. So if you can get away with 500 watt seconds, you can buy more than one, you're probably in good shape. Okay, so again, you can use DC for the studio as well as location, even if it doesn't plug in. You just have to worry about having enough batteries, making sure you're watching how many strobes you're popping. You don't want to run out of juice and then be dead in the water with a subject sitting there. So something to consider. All right. Next thing is digital versus analog. Okay. So as I said before, I use analog in the studio because they're inexpensive, and I got a little chart here to go over. So digital versus analog. All right. So with analog packs, they're typically legacy packs. Most lights and packs now are digital. And that's a good thing for sure. It gives you a tremendous amount of creative flexibility and power and precision and control that you just didn't have with analog. But in some cases it's overkill and you don't really need it. With analog, you only have on-off remote control, and typically you're going to need a wireless remote like a Pocket Wizard in order to do that. Okay, so you will need another purchase in order to do that. The good news is they're available used on eBay, for example. There's a large used market, and camera retailers like B&H, etc., have tons of used gear. So you can always pick up used pack-in heads and even monolights that are not digital. Typically they are only manual exposure. That's all you're going to get. Dial it up, dial it down, more power, less power, and that's okay. And the same thing with power adjustments. You're not going to be able to make those power adjustments from the camera, from a remote. You're going to have to walk over or have someone else walk over and physically make those adjustments at the pack or on the head, right? But again, the good news, less expensive. And unless you really want to work intuitively and be chimping constantly, you will need a light meter to read the light and make your metering and exposure determinations based on that. Right? Now, let's look at digital. Digital gives you full wireless remote control, meaning that you can adjust the power and groups right from the camera position. You can turn them on, you can turn them off. There's a ton that you can do with digital wireless remote control. Right? They have a digital interface, which gives you precise control. It makes it really easy to see what's going on with everything from your power to the groups that you're using, to which heads are on, to modeling lights, etc. They're really flexible, and I love them. But if you were to try and buy a 2400 watt second pack that's digital, you're looking at $10,000. So it really depends on what you need. Okay. Except if you go analog, you can pick up that same 2400 watt second pack. In the case of a Pro Photo, for example, a 7B or a 7A rather, you can pick up a 7A for like, I don't know, under $1,000, which is really amazing. Digital is more expensive when compared to analog, obviously, because you've got a lot more going on there. And it is better suited for location work. And I say that they're great for studio, but they're better suited for location work because of the remote control aspects, because you can do a lot from the camera with them. And if you have them up on a boom stand, if you're working with a monolight, for example, you don't want to have to be climbing up on a ladder and adjusting things from the back of the mono head. You can do that from the camera position. I think it's safer, it's quicker, and just better all the way around. Okay, so that's digital versus analog. So definitely worth considering. All right, modeling light. All right, the modeling light is really important. Modeling light allows you to see what the strobe is going to do, give you an approximation of what the light is going to give you when that strobe pops, where the shadows are going to fall, whether you've got catch lights in the eyes, those sorts of things. Now, typically, you've got LED versus tungsten. Tungsten is going to be with legacy packs, like the analog packs are typically going to have tungsten modeling lights, whereas the more current modern-day strobes are going to have LED lights. The cool thing about LED lights is they have an adjustable color balance, which means that you can, and adjustable power as well. And do you need those things? That's why there are question marks on these bullet points. Do you need adjustable color balance? Do you need adjustable power? I would argue that those are things that you're going to want. Adjustable color balance means that you can take the color balance from daylight to tungsten. So that has video applications. meaning that, or if you're shooting with other stills and you're mixing in tungsten lights, you're going to want to be able to match the color balance. Okay, if you're shooting video, you're going to want to be able to match the color balance of tungsten. So that's really important. But you also are going to want to be able to work with daylight color balance when you're working solely with strobe. Battery consumption with portable strobe. All right, so and LEDs are a lot better at this than tungsten, but even with LEDs, you have to be cognizant of how much power is being eaten up when you're using a modeling light. So typically what a lot of strobes will do is they will shut off the modeling light after a certain time. They don't let you just keep it on forever. I'm sure you can override that in some strobes, but there are power-saving mechanisms in place so that you don't burn out your battery really quickly. So definitely something to keep an eye on, and definitely something to be cognizant of is that when you're using a modeling light with a battery-operated strobe, it will impact the life of that battery. So you may get less strobe pops than you were counting on. So be careful with that. All right, recycle speed. This is another important feature. So you need to ask yourself when you're looking at recycle speed, how quickly do you shoot? How quickly do you need your strobe to be ready to fire again after you've made one shot? And that's going to be really important for fashion and sports shooters versus portrait and still life. So if you're shooting fashion and sports or beverage work, you're going to need really fast recycle speed, all right? Versus portrait and still life, where arguably it's a much slower workflow, so you're not going to need as quick recycle speed. You're not going to have that flash tube ready to fire again as quickly, so it can be a more mellow thing. And all of these things add up to more money, right? And trade-offs. Some will give you faster recycle speed, and some are going to give you more power, and you really need to balance all of these things and make kind of a Venn diagram of what are most important to you and how much budget you have and where you want to make those compromises and where you don't want to make those compromises. All right. Lastly is flash duration. Okay, so flash duration, what that means is the freezing power that the strobe can give you. Okay, the flash tube ramps up and reaches the peak of its output and then ramps back down. Okay, and it's how fast that happens, how quickly that happens, that determines the amount of freezing power that strobe, that flash tube can give you. Okay, so what you need to ask yourself is, what is your typical subject matter? What do you like to shoot? Are you shooting dancers? Are you shooting athletes? Are you shooting scientific work where you need to freeze something like a bullet flying through the air? Any kind of subject matter that requires you to freeze action is going to need a beverage work, again, to use that example, where you have water falling and you need to freeze that, or carbonated beverage, bubbles popping out. You need to freeze that stuff. So that's where a really fast flash duration is going to make a difference, okay? And also, do you want special effects, like stroboscopic effects? Those typically work kind of hand in glove with flash duration. So here are a couple examples. Here we used a fast flash, say that 5 times fast flash duration to freeze this fellow that I was shooting part of a promotional shoot for a band, and I had these guys jumping and running, and I really wanted to freeze that. I didn't want blur. I didn't want motion trailing in his feet and his arms, because he's flying through the air there. So you really need to be able to freeze that action, and that's where fast flash duration comes in. The faster the duration, the more freezing you're able to do of motion. All right. And in terms of special effects, here is that flash duration combined with a stroboscopic effect, where the strobe is able to fire multiple flashes really quickly. So here not only do we have fast flash duration, but we have rapid recycle time. Okay, now that's of course going to impact the amount of power output that you get, because it only reaches a certain amount of its max power when it's doing that kind of thing. But again, another one of those things to consider. All right, so that's going to wrap it up, guys. Those are the 8 things to consider when purchasing a strobe. I'm sure there are others, but these are my top 8, and these are the things that I would encourage you to think about when you're purchasing a strobe. Be sure and leave comments if you have additional questions. I'd be happy to answer them. And I will see you next month here at BehindTheShutter.com and Shutter Magazine. Take care, guys.